Hi, welcome to the Cinematography Salon podcast, a show about celebrating cinematography and inspiring both the current and next generation of visual artists, exploring the latest trends, techniques, technologies, and culture, and featuring exclusive interviews with some of the most talented and innovative cinematographers working today. Hi everyone, my name is Peter Pascucci, and this week we're changing things up a bit as Oren Sofer conducts a solo interview with the highly acclaimed visual effects artist Andrew Roberts. Andrew has an impressive career with 2 Emmy Awards and over 25 years of experience in the world of film and television. Notably, he served as the virtual production supervisor for Disney Plus's Obi-Wan Kenobi, and more recently worked as the on-set visual effects supervisor for the upcoming film The Creator, directed by Gareth Edwards and shot by Greg Fraser and Oren Sofer. In this episode, Oren and Andrew delve into some technical visual effects terminology, and to assist you in following along, we've included additional resources in the show notes. Andrew currently holds the role of Associate Visual Effects Supervisor at ILM, or Industrial Light and Magic, which is the renowned company founded by George Lucas in the 1970s. ILM has been responsible for groundbreaking visual effects work in iconic films such as the original Star Wars trilogy, Indiana Jones, E.T., and many more. We hope you enjoy the episode.
Thanks so much for joining us, Andrew. We're so happy to have you. Andrew worked with me on The Creator, the upcoming film. So we spent a lot of time together in Thailand and got to know each other. And I was really excited to have you come on the show. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm excited to dive into some questions about visual effects and ILM and your career and everything in between.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation, Oren.
Yay, yes. We'll start off with a question we actually typically avoid. We like to kind of dive right into the meat of things usually, but VFX is such an interesting and specific field that I think it would be really interesting to hear. And I'd certainly love to hear what initially inspired you to pursue a career in visual effects, and sort of if you can talk a little bit through your working in visual effects and working for ILM.
Sure, yeah. Well, it was an indirect route. If I'm thinking about how it started, I was a CAD draftsman back in the late 80s. And there was a real focus on precision. I picked up some of that from my father, who was a carpenter. Is it 1/2 inch or is it 7/16? You know, those details are sort of really important. And I really saw that focus on accuracy, that ability to convey a graphical image when I was working as a CAD draftsman.
Also, just for the listeners, CAD is a design software, right?
Exactly. Yes. And so CAD refers to the term computer-aided design. And there are a few programs. The program I was using at this architect's firm was called CADvance, but the leader in that field at the time and for many years after was AutoCAD, developed by Autodesk, and they're one of the largest software developers in the world. I got my degree as an analyst programmer, and so I was writing code. I got hired by this architectural firm where it was sort of like an overlap between writing code and then also doing computer-aided design. And so that was sort of an entry to software. I was with that company for a couple of years, and then I had an opportunity to join Autodesk, the makers of AutoCAD. And so initially I was testing software. Then I got into some technical writing for them, where I was working in the UK branch, and we would have to localize documents. The original reference manual would be produced in San Francisco, in Sausalito, actually, where the head office was. And then they would send that documentation to all the different territories, whether that's France or the UK or the Ivory Coast. And then local writers would localize the documentation, make adjustments specific for their market. So for me, it was changing to imperial from metric.
I see. Yeah. Important things to do in architecture, right? Because those are the little mistakes like in aerospace engineering where you mess up a rocket ship design because you forgot to translate from inches to centimeters or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. So this was sort of pretty early in my career where, as I say, I went from a draftsman to now working at Autodesk, getting introduced to different types of graphic software. And then I had this opportunity to be a writer for a short period of time, a technical writer. For me, as I made this transition from being introduced to computer graphics and then getting into using it for more artistic and entertainment purposes, it felt somewhat, it didn't feel right for me to describe myself as an artist in those early days. It just felt like pretentious for me to say it. I'm an artist. I was introduced to these 3D programs, and then my sort of knowledge of that world expanded from coding to architecture to engineering. And now I'm seeing, these programs are being used for animation and we're seeing them in movies, which was just so fascinating to me. And so I had an opportunity to join a games company. They were doing some really interesting things in motion capture and doing cinematic renderings for some of their games. I would say that for me, an inflection point was they sent me to SIGGRAPH. So I was still living in the UK, and SIGGRAPH is this annual convention. It stands for the Special Interest Group in Computer Graphics. And I went in 1994, Orlando was my first trip from the UK. And my boss sent me to this was sort of pre-internet, right? I landed in Orlando and was just blown away that there's this worldwide community of artists. And people were very open about the things they were trying, the techniques that they were attempting. And there was this thing called the electronic theater, where the world's best animation is it gets distilled down to 3 hours of the best work in the world. And so I'm seeing commercials, I'm seeing short films, students' work, samples of work that was featured in movies. It all gets distilled down to this 3 hours that we all, just the thousands of attendees, get to just sit and watch this collection of work. And it was just so incredibly inspiring just to see this work, to get these ideas about, wow, I'd never thought of using this tool in this way. And just the artistry was really quite inspirational. Around that same time, Jurassic Park, right, that came out in 1993.
Yes.
And the film itself was really inspirational. I remember the sense of awe, seeing the characters in the movie were responding with awe, as were we, the audience, right? The first time you see the raptor or the T-Rex, the Gallimimus stampede, right? It's like...
Yeah. I just saw it the other week. They did a 30th anniversary re-release in theaters of Jurassic Park. So I literally saw it a week ago. And it still blows me away. Like I've seen the movie 50 times or something. And every time you go see it, especially on the big screen, that awe is still there, and the visual effects and the CG dinosaurs, even though there's very little of it in the movie, less than people probably remember. There's probably, I think, only 12 minutes of CG shots in the film, but it's so memorable, and it's so game-changing and inspiring and beautiful and perfectly done that it really changed everything, at least from the film side in terms of acceptance of CG. And yeah,
it really did. And for me, it was the movie, but then also, as much, or perhaps even more than seeing the movie, there was an event held at the South Bank that one of the CG supervisors from ILM, Stefan Fangmeier, that he gave a presentation on the work of Jurassic Park. And that myself and a number of the colleagues from the games company I was at, we attended this. So seeing wireframe and shaded previews of the Stampede, getting to hear sort of the work they did and the challenges they had with storage and rendering and compositing, it really helped me to see that connection between the work I was doing as an artist at a games company doing cinematics and the work that they were doing at the highest level. That I saw that connection that, it's the same techniques, it's the same sorts of challenges that we're overcoming, although at a much higher level that ILM were at than what I was tackling. But I think that was sort of the seed for me that, I'm in this same world, like we're solving similar things. And I think that was the sort of beginning, that was the genesis of my hunger to get into doing more computer graphics, doing more animation, and that hopefully one day I could get into visual effects and maybe get to that level. That was the beginning. I had an opportunity to relocate to the States in the late 90s. In 97, I moved from London to LA. And I got to grow as an artist, going from an artist to a supervisor as that company was growing. And they were being taken on more ambitious projects, worked on the pilot for Alias and shots in Final Destination 2 and Elf and Talladega Nights. And that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What's interesting to me about your journey into this is that you actually really started from the technical and the software side and then found the artistic and the creative side through that process. And I guess the most obvious follow-up question here is, do you consider yourself an artist now?
I do, yeah.
Yes.
It took a while. Good. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. And there was, I'm a student of the crafts and a voracious reader. And so whether it's books about Gaudi or Michelangelo or architecture, that I'm constantly learning and trying to see like how I can expand my knowledge and build on the accomplishments of others. So yes, I do consider myself an artist. I think there was probably a time in the early 90s, I may have even made a comment to a colleague where there was something about being an artist, and I made some sort of self-deprecating comment, and he was like, dude, what are you talking about? Embrace it. This is what you do. You've been doing this for years.
Well, it's interesting because cinematography is always at this nexus of technology and art, because it's a very artistic and very creative endeavor, but it requires technology in order to achieve it. It requires, especially now, especially in the digital age. I mean, maybe in the analog age, it was a lot simpler. I mean, there was underlying technology, but it was photochemical exposure, emulsion, and development is, at the end of the day, was a pretty straightforward process. And once digital came in and it started becoming about ones and zeros and color space and resolutions and this and that, it greatly complicated the technology side of the art form. But visual effects, I think even more so, has always been at the nexus of those two disciplines. And even more so because, like you said, the technology and the software for visual effects came from the engineering world at first, and then was adapted in order to create entertainment and art, which is unique, right? Because cameras were designed to create photographs, right? This was technology that was designed to create artistic expression, whereas visual effects tools and technology, I think until today, like there's even now with the new technologies that we've all been working with, LED volumes and stuff like that, we're still mixing technologies from different disciplines, and now we're using a lot of technology from the gaming world and adapting it into filmmaking, and it doesn't always fit at first. Like there's a lot of adapting that needs to happen in order to kind of make these worlds communicate with each other. And I find that really fascinating. It seems challenging from the outset as I watch you and your colleagues work on these technologies, but it must be exciting to still have one toe in both worlds a little bit. And you are an artist, but you're also very much still steeped in the technological basis of this and the software base of it and the problem solving and the engineering. It's all still in there. It's all still
Right.
part of the process, right?
Yeah. And so once I embraced the artistic side of myself, that I find I'm also able to just lean on, okay, that there's an analytical, technical side to the work we do. And I'm, as an artist or as a supervisor, you benefit from both worlds. It's very much that blend of the two, left brain, right brain. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And then I think the other maybe tension that exists with visual effects, especially today, is that there's this expectation from an audience and from viewers that the best visual effects are invisible, in that they don't look like visual effects. They look like reality, right? Especially nowadays, I think the technology has reached a point where we can create such a high fidelity and a high level of visual effects that often the sort of most impressive quote unquote visual effects are the ones that maybe people don't realize are visual effects. And then they find out about it after the fact, right? There's such a natural and organic feeling quality to the visual effects that you've worked on and that ILM does. And I think that's very much sort of the house style and approach of that company. So like for you, as somebody who straddles that line between the technical and the artistic, like how do you sort of strike the balance of something being very technically complicated, but then ultimately visually effortless?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that it's so important to think about the role of an artist or of visual effects, that it's all in service of the story. And so that sort of for me is always first and foremost, that I'm trying to protect the film. I'm not losing sight of the big picture. The only picture is that we're contributing to a larger story. So for me, that comes down to doing research into understanding the story itself. So reading the script multiple times, right? Looking at other work that the director, the DP, the production designer, what have they done before and what are they contributing to this film? What is the aesthetic? Really steeping myself in all of that and understanding it so that the work that we're bringing to the screen is in support of that it's not in tension with the direction that everything is going. I think also a large part of it is understanding that I'm part of a team, and you never want to be the guy trying to determine or dictate the techniques being used, and leaning on the experience and the skill, the technical background of the sim artists, the animators, the riggers, the texture artists, everyone who's working on a project, and allowing them to bring their skill to it and bring their experience to the shot and to the sequence. So it's really about having that humility to understanding the top level, that I understand what the director, what the production designer was going for, but then giving your artists that space to contribute themselves and their background and their ideas to it. I think that all ends up just sort of being part of the mix, just going into the different layers that make a shot feel naturalistic and real. Always trying to lean on a plate as the initial sort of foundation for a shot, and researching nature, biology, chemistry, trying to anchor, even if it's an esoteric concept or idea, we need to do a jump in space or something, or okay, we're going to teleport or whatever it might be.
Right.
That is there some idea, like, okay, in astronomy, or gravitational lensing, what is that and how does it work? Okay, how do, butterflies work, or is there something in the insect world? So I'm always, and I've learned from great supervisors and artists who had a similar approach that, okay, lean on nature, try and find that as a foundation. Is there some inspiration that you can take from the world and then build your work on top of it?
That's such a good piece of advice, honestly, for filmmaking in general, and also cinematography. We've talked about this on the show before, but there does tend to be a little bit of a copy effect that happens even when directors and cinematographers share reference images with each other from other films. You just sort of continue this cycle of images that are inspired by other images that were inspired by, and then it just ends up becoming this feedback loop of, well, the original images, like the DPs that we're all sort of copying from originally, they were all inspired by exactly what you're saying and what Dennis Murin was saying. They're inspired by nature. They're inspired by the real world. They're inspired by natural light, or they're inspired by maybe painters, going all the way back to that art form. So I think that's really good advice also, just holistically from a filmmaking perspective. I want to talk a little bit about ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, which is such a sort of titan in the visual effects world, and in many ways has sort of pioneered and established the foundations for pretty much a lot of the visual effects industry, especially like the early days of visual effects. And yeah, for me, I was a Star Wars kid, right? So I grew up watching the Star Wars films and Indiana Jones and Back to the Future, and eventually becoming very interested in the behind the scenes and the making of those films. And so learning about the story of Industrial Light and Magic in 76 and the warehouse in Van Nuys and all this sort of mythos and the history of the company has always been so intrinsically interconnected with my interest in filmmaking in general. And so, I mean, it goes without saying that to be able to work with ILM on the creator was like a dream come true for the kid in me that grew up watching those special features on the Star Wars DVDs and VHS tapes first in my day. And by the way, for anyone listening who's interested in learning more about this, there's a great documentary series on Disney Plus called Light and Magic that kind of just told the whole ILM story, like origins, Star Wars, 80s, Jurassic Park. Like it just goes through all the milestones, and they talk to all the legends and that founded the company. And these are all like the Roger Deakinses of the VFX world, that I'm sure every visual effects artist like looks up to. So it's a great documentary and very human too. It explores the human side of these people. Can you talk to us about your connection to ILM and sort of what it's like, what it has been like working for a company with such a legacy in the film industry?
And yeah, it's every day I feel like it's a real privilege to be working at ILM. As I mentioned, Stefan Wangmeier back in the early 90s, me just hearing him talk about ILM's work on Jurassic Park. And since around that time, I mean, I have every copy of Cinefex since the early 90s. I've got like 30 years worth. And I've been particularly inspired by ILM's work over the years, like yourself also, a huge fan of Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back. So that's always been the gold standard for me, seeing the great work that they've done and the innovations they're responsible for. And artists that I've worked with earlier in my career, once I moved to the States in the late 90s, a number of them had an opportunity to work at ILM. And it was really exciting to me to hear that there was a gen department where they were using tools like 3ds Max. And of course, they had the proprietary tool set, and Maya, it was a very large part of what they were leaning on. But that gen artists were using exactly the same tool that I was very familiar with was something that was exciting to me. And I'd be thinking, hey, maybe one day I might have an opportunity to move to Northern California, and that would be really cool. And the move to Northern California turned out wasn't necessary because of virtual production and the teams that were at Manhattan Beach Studios for Obi-Wan Kenobi and Mandalorian, and that I was able to join them and use my on-set experience and my experience having been in post for some years and to get into virtual production with ILM was, really amazing. It's, as we mentioned, ILM has been around, started this industry, and there's a focus on excellence, and there's obviously the legacy of what was started by George Lucas and those innovators, and that's very much part of the DNA at the company. But what's really exciting to me, what I've appreciated, is that there's still really this focus on education, sharing knowledge, embracing challenges, working on new and exciting things. And at many companies, you have an opportunity to learn, sort of like, okay, this is our pipeline, this is how we do things. But there was really sort of this focus on education. And so it's been really great just to constantly be a student and for them to encourage and model asking questions, even as a supervisor or the creative directors, that we're in groups where people encourage asking questions and sharing case studies and, hey, this is what I'm coming across and how would you handle this? It's been great. Pinch myself. When I was on set with you, it was really exciting to be working on this project. I'm a fan of sci-fi, being into from Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury and those novels from back in the day. And then, of course, Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica. That I grew up on all of that stuff. And to be working on a project like The Creator and then working with ILM and the team that was assembled with Jay and having great production designers and artists, that was just a dream come true. And there were times I was like, I can't believe that I'm in this position. I'm in Thailand for 5 months on this amazing film, working for this amazing company. It was, pinch me. Is this real? And it's been a wonderful experience.
That's great to hear. I mean, the experience was the same for me. Being in Thailand, and the first time I typed an ILM email address, I was like, oh my God, this is actually happening. It's just cool to be a part of that legacy, even in a small part, and just to collaborate with it and work with it and create that kind of, something that slots into the kind of work that they've been doing from the start, and science fiction and world building, but also creating a visual effects approach that's very grounded and very real and raw and gritty and unpolished. And I thought it was really cool and exciting. So speaking of which, you were actually able to work in the Star Wars universe a couple of times, as you alluded to. I'd love to ask you a little bit about that. You worked as the virtual production supervisor on Obi-Wan Kenobi, which must have been quite a significant undertaking. So can you talk to us a little bit about the challenges and innovations involved in working on the Star Wars universe and contributing to that storied legacy and beloved work that has inspired, I think, a lot of filmmakers, especially sci-fi fans, and in particular your work using stagecraft, also known as the volume, quote unquote. Stagecraft is the ILM sort of innovated version of what's colloquially called the volume that was innovated on The Mandalorian. So tell us a little bit about that experience and the challenges, and give us a little peek behind the Star Wars curtain if you can.
Sure, yeah. So I was hired as a brain bar supervisor on Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the virtual production supervisor, the primary VP Sup for that show was Chris Baylog. We worked together, and then there was a second unit. He actually went on paternity leave for a period of the show, which is when I stepped into the VP Sup role. And that was such an interesting blend of leaning on my experience as an artist and someone who'd been in the games industry, so working with real-time engines, working in posts, and then having experience on set. And then virtual production is this blend of all of those disciplines. Obi-Wan Kenobi was my first intro to the world of virtual production. And I really didn't understand what virtual production was until arriving at ILM. And then seeing that, okay, it starts from the virtual art department, the VAD, where you have this collection of all of the creatives. So for Obi-Wan, it was Deb Chow, Doug Chang, you have the DP, Todd Chernikowski, who was the production designer, Pat Tubaka, visual effects supervisor, that everyone would be on this call together where we're sharing a screen and looking at a real-time version of Doug's concept art. That was sort of just so exciting to me to see, okay, we have this transition from this beautiful artwork that Doug Chang and his team had created, and then we're seeing it in 3 dimensions. And it's in a real-time format where they Deb could make adjustments to, okay, well, how about if we move the temple columns over to the left, and what does that do to the shafts of light? And, what does the camera look like? We need to move through these boards, and we need to transition, down this hallway. And how does that look, and what adjustments can be made? And so that first step was really exciting, just to be part of those Zoom calls and seeing, okay, there's this real-time environment that will then be translated to the walls. So now we go from these scouting sessions where there's a real-time feedback on the layout of the environment and what's happening with the light and what are the physical props versus what will be digital. So there are all these decisions that are being made as a group together in real time. And so it was such a great education for me to see that process and the way that ILM approaches virtual production, from that virtual art department to then taking the digital content, the various decisions that get made to get it on the walls, getting to interface with the in-house development team that work on Helios and Stagecraft, Helios being the real-time renderer that's used. And it really clicked for me the first time that I went down to MBS Stage 20 and they put the physical set, they dressed the physical set, and then the layout team worked to do their work to ensure that digital extension continued from where the physical set left off. And you just sort of walk into this space now and you're like, oh, okay, I'm on Tatooine, or, I'm in this temple, or I'm in this other location. And so that was just really great to see how the technology translates to the filmed set. But then also it was excellent to just see how that communication, that collaboration between the different departments works, where as the Obi-Wan team, we would benefit from learnings and discoveries that the Mandalorian team, that they had picked up on, or
Right.
our other volumes that were at the time at Pinewood or in Sydney on other films, that there's this network of communication where there were these wins, these discoveries, things that would be developed specifically for that show or that film, then get shared. Techniques are shared between the different shows. So it was good to be a part of that and to just see how the team would deal with some of these challenges, deal with translating between the two worlds of that very technical to the artistic, and softening, rounding off those edges so that a DP could be talking in terms of stops or of like temperature, and that if you needed it 5600, then we could enter that. And so the way that we talk, the way that we use our tools, that all of that needs to be in support of that and service of that, so that we're lessening that friction and helping the filmmakers tell their stories.
Yeah. And once again, the volume has sort of given us yet another nexus point between technology and artistic creation and filmmaking in this very immediate and tangible way. And in my experience with it on The Creator and some other projects, that's been the sort of most notable part of the process. Is no longer can you just wave away like, well, all this process that's going to happen in post that's not going to involve me. It's like, no, we really do need to foster this collaboration and this communication between the quote unquote post team, which is no longer, it's not really about post. It's just about visual effects and technological production, supporting physical production, cinematography, production design, and all these other physical elements. And it's all happening at the same time now. And we all need to figure out how to talk to each other and how to communicate and how to use the technologies and leverage it. And it's very challenging, but it's very interesting. And I mean, we're in very early days of this technology. So I think these workflows are only going to get better. And with each passing one, it is really great to hear the culture of education and that goes on at ILM, because I think that's probably the most important thing. And, on the DP side, we obviously don't all work for a company, but the cinematography community fosters those communications and that education amongst itself, which I think is really great. In that regard, I was actually curious to hear if you had any thoughts on what kind of advice you would give to like aspiring cinematographers who are maybe interested in knowing more about visual effects, learning about how to best approach the collaboration with a visual effects supervisor. Like, what would your advice be on best practices for a DP who maybe hasn't had that kind of experience yet? And maybe what do you think might be some of the bigger misconceptions that cinematographers and directors might have about visual effects that you've encountered that are myths that can be dispelled on a visual effects heavy project?
Well, you touched on the Light and Magic documentary on Disney Plus. I think that's a really excellent resource. I would recommend any aspiring cinematographer, take that in to sort of help to understand the history of the craft and where it's going. I was thinking of other resources. Well, Cinefx for me, it's a shame that that magazine they closed down a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that was pretty recent because it was quite ubiquitous. Yeah,
it really was. Because Cinefx for me and Cinefastique were two magazines that I read voraciously, and it helped to sort of open my eyes to the world of visual effects. I think something that a couple of resources that are doing a good job of taking the place of Cinefx. There's the Before and Afters website and podcast.
I was going to say that one too. Yeah. I think they're great.
Yeah, that's excellent. Lots of really good interviews and as I say, there's a podcast as well as the website itself that will talk to production designers and to visual effects supervisors and CG supervisors, and they will deconstruct their work and how they approach working on a film. Getting familiar with that world, I think, would be super helpful, and just listening to some of those, just going through that website, I think is a good primer to the world. Also, CG Garage is another one I would recommend. And that was an offshoot from Chaos Group, the company behind the V-Ray renderer that's used pretty much in from Houdini to Maya to 3ds Max, and every program there's a version of V-Ray, which is a photorealistic render. They've done a lot of research in other areas. They've got I think it's called the Virtual Human Project, but there's a CG supervisor, Chris Nichols, who is the host of the CG Garage, and he's been a visual effects supervisor. He's been in the industry for decades. I think he started off as an architect and then got his way into the industry that way, but he does a ton of research, and he gets into some really in-depth conversations, again, with visual effects supervisors, production designers, pipeline guys who are developing pipelines for studios, and really gets into the nuts and bolts and helps deconstruct the industry. But I think that those would be resources I would point to. I think also the, what is that website on YouTube? The Corridor Crew. Yeah. They have a very sort of open approach to visual effects, and they make it quite accessible, and they really do sort of like have a love and fascination for it. And there are probably other resources out there, but I've enjoyed just clicking on those sort of VFX Artists Reacts or some of the interviews that they do just to help build and fill in.
Those are great. I would also recommend following Todd Vaziri on Twitter.
Absolutely. Yes.
Great resource. But in general, I think it's really just about, I think, not fearing the unknown. Like I mentioned, I've always been interested in visual effects just as a filmmaking nerd and a film history nerd who's always interested in ILM from the Star Wars connection, and then became interested in visual effects beyond that. But I think it's just helpful for DPs maybe who haven't had the chance to work on a visual effects project or work with a VFX supervisor. Like if you do find yourself in that situation, like just be interested, be curious, and ask questions, and don't fear something just because it's very technical and it can feel sometimes very outside of our wheelhouse. Because I think once you look under the hood a little bit, you realize that like one of the biggest things that all of these resources that you mentioned talk about, especially when they interview visual effects artists and supervisors, is lighting. And lighting is so important to visual effects because that's the bridge between visual effects and live action photography, is matching the lighting. And that's what we do. We do lighting. There's such a common ground there, and visual effects artists, I think, really understand light, sometimes even more than DPs, I think, because you have to understand light down to its core physics-based elements, because the software is simulating how light behaves in the real world based on physics. It's not a facsimile. It's actually really recreating like the physics-based conditions for light and subsurface scattering and textures and all these things. And so I love hearing visual effects artists talk about light because it just affirms how important that is. And I think that is the most important part of cinematography as well. So yeah, I think all of those are really great resources that you mentioned as well. And I definitely read and watch a lot of those too. And there's some I hadn't heard of, so I'm going to look those up.
Yeah, check them out. I think you'll enjoy CG Garage. I would absolutely agree with you on that curiosity. And that was what I found so refreshing when we were on set together. And you would have these questions, and which I just welcomed, like, okay, yeah, let's talk about global illumination or how light might bounce, or an approach, sort of how a VFX artist might solve this particular problem. If a DP or a cinematographer hasn't had exposure to the world of visual effects, it might initially seem daunting, but it really it's just another tool in service of filmmaking. And then once you get into it, you realize, oh, yeah, it's just another tool. And yeah, it can be incredibly powerful, but no reason to shy away from it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I was just thinking about the second part of your question, which was preconceptions or misconceptions, I should say. And I think this is, particularly with virtual production, I think that this mindset is sort of going away, that idea of fixing it in post,
Yeah.
And when you're on a set, time is money. And so I absolutely understand the desire to keep things moving, and that the idea to sort of wait a couple of minutes because we need to shoot this HDRI or we need to scan this set. That's time that, you're thinking, oh my goodness, like I'm thinking about sort of how much I'm burning every minute. But that idea of fixing it in post or kicking the can and delaying those decisions, they end up being sort of really costly. It's important to have all the information for a visual effects team that capturing that means that you're going to be able to deliver a better shot in the end. I think I would recommend just sort of avoiding delaying decisions. And maybe this is sort of more for directors and filmmakers more so than DPs, but sometimes not giving sufficient thought to something in the moment, or perhaps changing direction later, when you're faced with the reality of, oh, yeah, we really should have thought about this, sort of 2 months ago. Those are things that I would recommend sort of avoiding, and treating visual effects as you would costumes or props, and trying to give it serious thought up front and making a decision and then sticking with it.
So we've touched on this a little bit, but you've also worked as an on-set visual effects supervisor, including on The Creator, which can be a much different and certainly far more physical role than an overall visual effects supervisor who's overseeing visual effects work and delivery during production and in post, but tends to work a little bit more behind a computer as opposed to in front of the camera. So can you talk a little bit about the joys and the challenges of the on-set visual effects supervisor role, and sort of how that manifests differently maybe than most of the rest of the visual effects pipeline?
Sure. Generally, if you're going on set or you're working as an on-set supervisor, you will be involved from quite early on, generally sort of pre-production and then prepping for going on set. And so one of the joys is just really having that connection to the entire process, being familiar with the story, then being on set and seeing, okay, what are the elements that you're actually capturing, and then having to work with the various filmmakers and stakeholders on set, on production. Fraser Churchill, great ILM soup, I'm quoting him now, where he said that in prep, you write the recipe, and in production, you gather the ingredients, and then in post, you cook the meal. And that sort of feels quite apt. And so when you're in production and when you're on set, it's all about gathering the right ingredients. There's a sense of responsibility that I'm capturing the content that my team will use, or the team will use, to get the shots done. And so that's sort of quite weighty, that, I need to make sure that I capture these lighting conditions, because I'm going to need to put some characters in this village and they need to look like the actors, and they need to receive the same shadows and the bounce from the muddy ground, or the shadows from the hut. It's important to figure out the best way to collaborate with everyone on set, that there are times you need to compromise and understand the realities of, yeah, it would be great for us to capture this, but we're losing light and we need to do a company move. And dude, there's no one has time for you we don't have the 10 minutes. I'm sorry. I think that dance is really important to figure out when you're on set, working with the team, understanding the importance of that relationship with the first AD and the production designer, and working together to solve problems, building goodwill, inspiring confidence. And there is a physical component to that too. You and I had that sort of in Thailand, dealing with maybe humid conditions, or getting up very early and then trudging up a hill because we want to capture something at sunrise. Getting up at 3 a.m. so we can do that hour drive and be there and set up ready for the 5:15 sunrise. And so there's also that part of taking care of yourself physically. I brought Bengay with me and ankle supports, and just trying to get as much sleep as possible, knowing, okay, I need these 6 hours because we've got a 16-hour day ahead of us.
You could do 6? I can't. 6 isn't enough for me.
It's a stretch, but you couldn't. On our 7th day, I know I'm going to probably sort of like sleep for 10 or
sleep through
the day. And then just always looking at, anticipating some of the problems that might come up. We were lucky enough to have some great storyboards from James Klein, and there was lots of great material that was provided to us for The Creator. And for me, it was just important to be constantly reviewing them, looking at the script, looking at the shot breakdown for the day, imagining those shots, and then anticipating what are some of the issues that might come up, and then figuring out, okay, what would the solutions to those potential issues be? So yeah, those are some of the things that I think are important as an on-set soup. And being a communicator. So we had the opportunity to, that was what I really looked forward to with the mornings. We would get sort of on set and there would be call time, but we would get there an hour before call time. So you and I and Gareth and our first AD, we would all go through, okay, this is what we have set up for the day. And then I might say, okay, for these 2 shots, this is what I'm going to need, or, let's prep ourselves for that. And then you would talk through, okay, I'm going to need to get these lights in this position, or, okay, I'm going to need time to make these adjustments. And so having that communication and just planning is so important. And so I think that communication is really key. And it made me look forward to every day. Like, okay, we're going to figure out what we're going to get done. And then at the end of the day, when we would normally be driving back together to the hotel, and we'd reflect on, okay, how was that for you? And, what do we have, coming out tomorrow? Often as visual effects artists, you don't get that opportunity to be creating the ingredients, being part of, okay, this is what we're capturing. And so that's very exciting to me to be part of that process. And it also just means that now when I get to post, I'm able to sit with the team and really give them context on, okay, this was really important to the director. These were some of the things that he didn't care so much about, but this thing was critical. It might not necessarily be in a turnover note or written down somewhere, but having been there and seen him wrinkle his nose at any time purple was present on set, or knowing that he has an aversion to certain colors, or
I hated purple.
Purple, right? And so knowing that, then that's something you can pass on. So that's really a privilege to be able to take that information and see, okay, this is what we shot, and now how do we turn it into something beautiful to support the final product?
Yeah, fantastic. This is great, Andrew. We're nearing the end here, so I have one final question to ask you. We've touched throughout the interview about the sort of culture of education at ILM, and also the ethos of this show really is grounded in education and fostering an open environment where we can tackle interesting, difficult questions and hopefully help out aspiring cinematographers and filmmakers as well as ourselves along the way. So I know that you, on a personal level, are also quite interested and dedicated to mentoring artists, especially from underrepresented backgrounds, through the Academy Gold program, which you're involved in. And we really knew that we wanted to talk about that on the show when we read about that. So can you talk to us a little bit about that program and what motivates you specifically to focus on education and fostering opportunities and specifically supporting diversity and inclusion within the visual effects industry? And how do you believe that contributes to the sort of culture of filmmaking and visual effects moving forward?
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing that up. My background, my parents are from the Caribbean. My mother's from Barbados, my father from Grenada. I was born in the UK. It took me a while to find this field and this discipline. I was interested in art when I was at school, but I think teachers assumed, based on their limited exposure to me, there were assumptions about what my capabilities, my interests, and my potential was. So I didn't really benefit from the encouragement or mentorship or direction that I might have been able to avail myself of at the high school level. And in the work setting, often in client meetings, I was one of one. I'd be certainly the only Black British person, but generally, often at many facilities, the only person of color, the only Black man working within visual effects. I remember going to a presentation where I saw the animation supervisor he was the animation super on Happy Feet. He was actually talking about his work on The Matrix. Lyndon Barwa, he's an animation supervisor. And I was really inspired just to hear, and he's a Black man, African-American, and he's been working in the industry for decades. And it was really inspirational just to hear him talking about his work on these different movies. And later on, I had an opportunity to work with him on a couple of films on The Tree of Life and Sucker Punch. And then we got to work on some personal projects of his as well. And I think even just seeing other people of color working in the industry reflected on me, wow, that's inspirational, that's great. And I had no idea that there were people working at this high level, and they've been doing that for many years. And just reflecting on how it boosted me, even after having been in the industry for a while, I acknowledged and I realized that I can set an example by my presence to have others feel confident that they're able to do it too. Like, if you see it, then you realize that you can be it yourself. So the Academy Gold program is really focused on introducing the world of film to filmmakers from underrepresented backgrounds. And so it was a privilege for me to be a mentor where we would just dedicate 6 months where we would get to talk to these artists, understand their goals and aspirations, it ends up really becoming sort of a lifelong relationship, but then you're helping them with all sorts of things. So you're giving context about the industry, you're finding them out about what their goals and their aspirations are, and helping guide them, ask questions about, where they see themselves, and then helping to guide them. But then it also expands into other things, like about how to formulate a resume or how to craft a show reel, but then how to compose an email, or just other networking suggestions about how you might reach out to someone for a coffee chat. Along with the Academy Gold, which has been great, and I've been helping them for a few years, there's an organization called Inclusion FX, and it's inclusionfx.com, I believe is there. They have a YouTube channel where they've interviewed just people from underrepresented backgrounds. And again, it's just that same idea of just sort of shining a light on people who have been working in the entertainment industry, and whether it's film, television, games, just talking about how they got their start and like their perspective and their viewpoint on the industry. There's another group called Afro VFX that I've been privileged to assist, where they've been working with studios in Montreal and students in the Ivory Coast, and helping them learn about the world of animation, visual effects, getting them up to speed with some of the techniques of filmmaking, exposing them now to real-time engines and some of the other technology, and just really helping them to grow. And so through all of these initiatives, just feel like there are just so many interesting stories, people from so many fascinating backgrounds, and just helping to open the world to them and realize that, okay, this is possible for me to do it, and that my uniqueness is actually a superpower. I think it benefits from that diverse background, and that sort of like a unique perspective of people that might be marginalized. So anything I can do to just help give them a voice, make them feel sort of like a little more confident about sharing their stories and their perspectives, I feel like I'm doing a good thing.
Yeah, I love that. Well, we can't thank you enough for coming on this show and sharing your story and sharing your perspective and experience and knowledge. And it was a real pleasure to chat with you. So thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Oren. I really enjoyed it.
This episode of the Cinematography Salon podcast was produced by Peter Pascucci, Oren Sofer, and David Kruta, with original music by One Wave. We created this episode in partnership with the Cinematography Salon, and we would like to extend a special thanks to the salon community for sourcing topics for this episode. If you enjoyed listening to the episode, we encourage you to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media to stay up to date with our latest episodes and news. Thanks.